Hello, this is Hakwan Lau from UCLA and the University of Hong Kong. Today I will talk about consciousness and fear. The question I want to ask is, are we alone in the entire animal kingdom in having the capacity to experience emotions? By emotions I mean things like fear, sadness, joy, things that give life its flavor, make things interesting and meaningful. Can other animals feel them like we do? Now, this may seem like a silly question, because on the internet you find videos like this. So, certainly, dogs can experience emotions, right? But the problem is, we anthropomorphize. That is, we project our psychology onto animals and objects. Look at this plant, the Mimosa pudica, also called the shy plant. As you touch it, it behaves as if it shies away. If you use a bit more imagination, you can think of it as being afraid too, perhaps. But do we really think that plants can be afraid? As in having the conscious experience of fear? This is a problem Darwin wrestled with as well. When he wrote about the expressions of emotions in animals and humans, he was probably right that these expressions may share a common evolutionary history. But how do we know that our subjective experiences were also common? Perhaps the behavioral expressions have always been there throughout evolution, but the conscious experiences may be relatively new, only in species like ourselves. When pressed about this, turned out Darwin didn't really have an answer. He just said it was more cheerful to think of animals in human terms. Well, perhaps we need something more scientifically rigorous than that. I suppose we can all agree that humans are conscious, and many may think that other primates are too. But how about other mammals, like a cat? How about birds, amphibians, reptiles, fish, shellfish, bugs? And what about robots too? Some say that you have to be alive to be conscious, but that would rule out the robots. But then an oyster is alive, trees too, or even bacteria. Are they more conscious than a robot? And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have stones. I suppose we can all agree that they aren't conscious. Well, actually I can introduce you to some colleagues who think that stones may be conscious too, but you may not want to meet them. So let's say we consider stones not to be conscious for now. So which of these creatures are conscious? I guess we all cut the line somewhere to say some of these things are conscious and some aren't. Let's say we say that fishes are conscious, but shellfish aren't. But just how exactly do we justify this cutoff? It all seems a bit vague, more like guesswork than science. There is a way to do this scientifically. The idea is we start with what we know, that is the human case. Within a person, some mental processes are conscious and some aren't. We know which is which with some degree of certainty because the person can tell you verbally. Typically, we want to do this with visual stimuli, things that we can manipulate easily. So let's say we present an apple to subjects. We ask if they consciously see the thing. Then we can ask them to press a button to indicate what it is that they see. For example, is it an apple or an orange? So normally people will consciously see the apple and are able to do the apple-orange discrimination task. Let's call this the conscious condition. And then we can also have a non-conscious condition too. Maybe we present the same apple with some tricks that we borrow from vision psychophysics. We can visually mask out the stimuli, or we can do binocular suppression, or we can stimulate the brain, something like that. So this way we render the apple invisible. Subjects will not be able to do the apple-orange discrimination task better than chance. They will say they don't see what it is in front of them. So we have this non-conscious condition for comparison. When we compare these conditions, the conscious one and the non-conscious one, we can look for what kind of neural activity differs between the conditions. These are then called the NCC, the neural correlates of consciousness. Let's say the NCC are in a particular brain region. We can now go to different animals and see whether they have similar activity in this brain region too. Or maybe they don't even have this homologue. That is, they may not even have the equivalent brain circuits. By looking at things like this, we can then determine if an animal is conscious. Of course, this is not a solid deductive proof. It's based on induction. We are assuming that the NCC will generalize to different species. We will come back to this point in a bit, but at least one can see there is some logic to this. We can call it a scientific approach, more or less. Of course, this NCC approach is not new, but it has a major conceptual problem that is not so often appreciated. The problem is, in comparing these two conditions, the conscious and the non-conscious, is consciousness the only thing that differs? Or are we just comparing a big perceptual signal versus a tiny, almost non-existent perceptual signal? By signal, I don't really mean the physical stimulus. Of course, that is there in both cases. By signal, I refer to the information that is successfully processed and transferred from the inputs, the eyes, to the output, that is the button press made by the hand. When you have a good signal, I mean it goes through this channel successfully, meaning meaningful information processing takes place. You press the right button accordingly. You see that the problem is, in the non-conscious condition, not only are the subjects not consciously seeing, they also don't have the relevant processing going on. They just can't do the task at all. So in this sense, it is not surprising at all that the NCC is pretty much everywhere in the brain. What has been found may not be specific to the subjective experience of seeing. No wonder people report all sorts of NCC, like widespread gamma activity, activations in frontal parietal networks, etc. And then some folks may say we have to more carefully control for confounds. When you do that, and when you focus on methods that are less sensitive, like ERP instead of neuronal recording, then of course you see less activity surviving these controls. What you find then may just be some activity in the visual cortex. Again, this may not be surprising at all. The comparison is about a very big visual signal versus a tiny visual signal. When you get rid of the more subtle stuff, what you have left will be some activity in the visual areas. It may sound funny, but this really pretty much summarizes the current debates on NCC. Fortunately, there is a way to fix this. You see, the problem is with this non-conscious condition. Not only was subjective experience missing, you also don't have much information processing going on at all. So we need a better matched condition where subjective experience is selectively impaired. And this would be blind sight, the neurological condition, that after restricted lesions to the primary visual cortex V1, people may still be able to guess what the stimulus is in front of them. They say that they only do this by guessing, which is to say that they don't report seeing anything at all in the affected visual field. This way, we can say that the visual signal, as reflected by the ability to do the corresponding visual discrimination task, is more or less matched between the conditions. In fact, if we really want to match it perfectly, we can present a slightly weaker stimulus in the conscious condition so that in both conditions, task performance would be exactly identical. So we have done some work like that. In blindsight patient GY, the lesion was restricted to the left hemisphere, so only half of his visual field was subjectively blind. By presenting simple visual stimuli to his intact and blind field respectively, we asked him to press keys to discriminate what the stimuli were, as well as to say whether he saw the stimuli consciously or was he just guessing. As you see, accuracy in the discrimination task was matched between the normal and blind fields. This was because we titrated the stimuli and presented something at lower contrast at the normal field. And yet, even at this low contrast, GY said he saw the stimuli in the normal field about half of the time. For the blind field, he almost never saw it. There were a few percentage of trials in which he said yes for the blind field, but that's because we encouraged him to use the yes response liberally to indicate any kind of visual experience. In some trials, he might have felt the presence of something, possibly through light scatter to the normal field. But as you see, these events are very rare and could be discarded from the analysis too. So we can now compare a conscious condition against a non-conscious control condition and look for the NCC. What we found is that the frontal parietal activations typically found in these visual NCC studies survived. They were found even though the two conditions did not differ in task performance accuracy. We can do this in subjects from the general population too. They don't have blind sight, but we could find stimuli that look somewhat different and yet give similar task performance levels. So here we used a technique called metacontrast masking. and we varied the timing of the mask. The visual discrimination task was just to say whether a simple shape was a square or a rhombus. As you see, we once again titrated the stimuli so that the two conditions gave very similar discrimination accuracy levels. This time, the difference in subjective awareness was smaller, only about 10% or so. In a way, that's what you expect though. These subjects were not blindsided. The stimuli only differed in subtle ways. However, during the same comparison, we again found activity in the prefrontal cortex that was associated with the condition in which subjects said they saw the target more often. In this study, we did not find difference in the activity in the visual cortex at all. This is not to say there is no activity there. After all, there is a visual difference between the conditions caused by a visual manipulation. Perhaps fMRI was just not sensitive enough to pick up the difference. But still, it is interesting to see that the difference in the prefrontal cortex were more pronounced, which is quite different from what you normally expect in these studies. So because of these findings, some of us have come to think that the NCC involves specific circuits in the prefrontal cortex, in particular the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the frontal pole.